You can see my screen, right?
Yeah. Yeah, perfect.
All right. So thank you. Thank you very much for everyone for being here today for this event promoted by University of West Georgia, Gender, Sexuality and Disability, a crip theory approach to a necessary conversation. So I am Rosa Traversa, Assistant Professor of Psychology at University of West Georgia. And first of all, I'd like to start this event today by thanking especially and starting with my psychology program that I am probably part of, as well as my department, so the Department of Anthropology, Psychology and Sociology at University of West Georgia, for making this event possible and for supporting this kind of research here at West Georgia. And I'd like also to make a specification, especially addressed to UWG students here present. So as any UWG employee, I am also, this is a reminder, of course, I am a mandatory reporter to the Title IX office for any kind of disclosure regarding of sexual violence, abuse that you might share today with us. So just a reminder that I am a mandatory reporter in this respect. So today we are going, and I am especially delighted to introduce our guest, that is Dr. Andrea García-Santesmases Fernandez from the National Distance Education University in Madrid, with whom I will be in dialogue with this very brief introduction. Another important information that I'd like to share with all of you is that you are free to leave any comment and questions in the chat down below, and I will take care to read them aloud once our guests will be done with their talk. So just to give you a few information about Dr. Andrea García-Santesmases Fernandez biography. So she is an assistant professor at the Department of Social Work at National Distance Education University in Madrid, and she just came back from her visiting period as researcher at Lund University in Sweden. So her academic background is at the intersection of sociology and anthropology, and her main research interest lies into a focus on body and sexuality. And I've read also some of her most recent work on embodiment in terms of body tools and body prosthesis that is really interesting for a number of people that are joining us today from many different academic backgrounds. Something about today's conversation, this will be revolving around how the ableist system position, as you can see here, certain bodies and functions as disabled and others as able-bodied. So we will go through a number of layers and intersection between patriarchy, the ableist system, as well as how different social movements, and I will add personal affectivities, may create interesting alliances and can reach, as Andrea says, important key issues regarding the right to one's own body or a pleasurable sexuality. So I'd like to introduce this event by positioning myself as a psychology scholar. And I actually chose this quotation from Margaret Wetherell's book, 2012 book, called Affect and Emotion, that I thought is particularly relevant when it comes to designate the psychology status sciences in relation to other social sciences, for instance, sociology and anthropology. So when we talk about psychology, are we talking about a necessary psychological rupture that we are focusing on? And in this little quotation from Wedderell's discussion over the pros and cons of social psychoanalysis, I think that in this discussion where she's referring especially to Nancy Chodorow's work on social psychoanalysis, Margaret Whitwell is especially addressing what is the nature of the interaction or interaction between psychology and other social sciences. And I would say the social and cultural meanings, which is really the difference between social and cultural meanings and personal affective meanings. So she goes on saying the social material enters the inner world, but like light passing through a prism, it gloriously or dreadfully emerges again in a remarkably transformed state. So this quotation literally speaks to this kind of relationship. Does the social materiality enters being totally transformed by the psyche, or which kind of transformation entails and is assumed in psychology, in what, according to a psychoanalytical view, could be still seen as a mystery, exactly as the inner box. So I would like to push all of us to also think about this throughout this conversation. Then I chose a couple of quotations from a philosopher, Spanish philosopher, Paul Beatriz Preciado, who has been working on a revolutionary book that is called Testo Junkie in the English translation that was published in 2013, and that the philosopher herself was describing as an author theory. So in this book, the philosopher who actually teaches political history of the body has been going through a very vivid example of how to describe an embodied, I wouldn't say transition, because Preciado has been keeping both names as well as words related to the previous existence as a female person, as well as the more recent, more male-oriented identity. So that's why Paul Beatriz. So not even embracing a neutral name. Here, Preciado says, and I chose exactly this couple of quotations in order to try to make sense with all of you of the supposed neutrality, in this case of testosterone, as the specific hormones through which Preciado has been hacking the gender system, but just in a broader sense, in a way to try to question the neutrality of all biological fluids, biological entities. So Preciado goes on saying, during this period, I spend my time with my trans friends. Some are taking hormones as part of a protocol to change sex, and others are fooling with it, self-medicating, without trying to change their gender legally or going through any psychiatric follow-up. They don't identify with the term gender dysphorics and declare themselves gender pirates or gender hackers. I belong to this latter group of testosterone users. We're copyleft users who consider sex hormones free and open biocodes, whose use shouldn't be regulated by the state or commandeered by pharmaceutical companies. So as you can see, Preciado is always very interested in this microgeneric, micro-political way to deal with the narration, with the experience, the ongoing experience of taking hormones, and always putting the very agency of the body in the foreground. And this is especially something that I think will be important in today's conversation with Dr. García-Santesmases, because what I also find very important in Andrea's work is her, despite being a sociologist primarily, I found that she has a special psychological sensitivity in her intellectual research work when it comes to analyze body and disability. So I also chose the second quotation from Testo Junkie, from Paul Beatriz Preciado, because I thought that this is exemplar and an extremely vivid example of how the body is not a passive entity that does not need to be acted upon in a very special way in order to make sense by itself, in order to transform everything that is merely in its proximity. So Preciado goes on saying, no drug is as pure as testosterone in gel form. It's odorless. However, the day after I take it, my sweat becomes sickly sweet, more acidic. The smell of a plastic doll heated by the sun comes from me. Apple liqueur abandoned at the bottom of a glass. It's my body that is reacting to the molecule. Testosterone has no taste or color, leaves no traces. The testosterone molecule dissolves into the skin as a ghost walks through a wall. It enters without warning, penetrates without leaving a mark. You don't need to smoke, sniff, or inject it, or even swallow it. It's enough to bring it near my skin. And I would like you to pay attention, especially to this part. It's enough to bring it near my skin. And its mere proximity to the body causes it to disappear into and become diluted in my blood. So I thought that especially these two this last sentence is really emblematic of how the body is agentic and how the body actually reinvents what it's been experiencing. And I would like to conclude my brief introduction by speaking a little bit to what I call the untold and disembodied of sexuality, that I really hope that we will be a little bit able to unpack today with Andrea's work. And in order to do that, I chose exactly a quotation from the very first part of a chapter recently published by Dr. García-Santesmases herself. So in her field notes back to March 2014 in Barcelona, she says, the presentation of the book on disability and sexuality was followed by a question and answer session. A young, intellectually disabled man told the audience that he visited Madame X, a brothel keeper from Barcelona who was praised in the book for running an accessible brothel, and that he was very satisfied with the service. Most of the members of the audience applauded. Madame X, who was also present, smiled and nodded. An old man with cerebral palsy then said, 50 euros for a blowjob sounds like a lot to me. Why do we have to pay? I want sexual freedom. Some people clapped again. So I think that it's noteworthy also some of the questions that Andrea asked herself in the chapter about this, and with which I'm going really towards the end of my introduction. If at a public event, a non-disabled man spoke about having sex with a prostitute, it is unlikely that it would be applauded. And even less so if you were a non-disabled man complaining about the price of fellatio, calling for it to be free as part of a demand for sexual freedom. This would most likely be greeted with laughter or rejected outright. However, in the situation described here, this attitude is in fact rewarded. What conceptual and political framework is operating here? How do gender and disability intersect when we try to understand and evaluate disabled people's demands for their sexuality to be recognized? So I'm going to stop here. Yeah, I'm going to stop here, and you still see my...
No.
You don't see it anymore, okay.
No.
So I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to ask Andrea, what is happening here? What happened there? So I'm giving the floor to you, and thank you all very much. I will also collect comments from Facebook that we will be live streaming right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosella, for the presentation and overall for the invitation and organizing this event. I'm really happy to be here, even if it's online, but to have the opportunity to discuss with some colleagues and students from the United States is really an honor. I've never been there, so let's hope next time we can do it in person. I will be more than happy to visit you there. So let me share my screen and share with you what I prepared for today. So, yeah, I have called this presentation Gender, Sexuality and Disability, a crip theory approach to a necessary conversation. My idea today is to cover 3 topics. So first of all, we should reflect together about what is disability. Sometimes disability is a category that we take for granted. We think it's quite obvious what disability means, but I would like to challenge this common sense regarding ability and disability. Secondly, I would like to present the result of my PhD thesis that was based in the Spanish context, and I analyzed how crip and queer meet in the Catalan activists, what projects they did together, and I could join that activism because I was part of a project that is called Yes We Fuck, and I will talk about that in detail later. And finally, I would like to propose this necessary conversation. That is what Rosella was talking about. So what happened when sexism and ableism intersect, how we think, evaluate, and embody gender and disability, and what is the role of sexuality in this game. So let us start with disability. And maybe when we think about disability, these are the first images that come to our mind. So we associate disability with impairment, with a deficit, a problem, and a question of accessibility or inaccessibility, a social problem, or something related to the fight against barriers. However, I think that disability is a biopolitical category that nominates certain group of people and serve in a way to regulate these people, but not only them, but to regulate all of us. So the idea of there are disabled people that are essentially disabled and able people, I would like to point out that this is a social construction equivalent to gender, race, and other social variables and power categories. We can think about that, seeing how in different moments through the history and in different cultural contexts, what disability means change. So our idea of disability is really an heresy, is something that started in the 20th century when we start to see disability as a medical problem, a question of individual bodies that don't work in the normative way, individual minds that don't work in a normative way, and should be rehabilitated. So in the 20th century, with the development of the rehabilitation system, the medical advances, the science, we see disability as something that can be and should be overcome. This is really related to the idea of the injured men and how they came back from the war and are disabled, are amputees, but want to be included in society. So all the special industry, as we call special education, special transport, or special jobs, works towards to integrate them again. But this idea of disability as the medical model as an individual problem, as an impaired bodies or mind, is quite recent. And just taking a look, to put an example to the freak shows, maybe you recognize some of these images. On the right, there is an image from the film Freaks that I strongly recommend. It's a great film. And it's filmed with real actors that were people that worked in a freak show at the moment. And what I want to point out with these images is that these people that were together in the freak show, today, currently, we call them with different labels as disabled, or also people with a migrant background or sexual diversity. So we use different categories that we think that talk about body differences, but talk about political differences. Because in that moment, what freak shows were showing was the difference that was essentialized in that way and was called in different ways. Another image of disability that challenged this idea that is subject to an impaired body is when in United States, precisely, they started to politicize their identity. So they started to fight for rights, for an independent living, which means they want to decide for themselves. This is the slogan, nothing about us without us. But also the politicization of disability category is related to the politicization of other categories. And you can see how they allowed to Martin Luther King or to the civil rights, because they are talking about their rights as a product of a social oppression. And also there are some allusion to the gay movement. So parallel to this independent living movement, in the British University, some disability scholars started to theorize the social model of disability, which is based on the idea that disability is not an individual question, but a political and social one. So the disabled body is disabled by society because it's not ready or prepared for their differences. It's interesting in that regard to think about how currently there are some critical disability studies that do a deeper analysis of how ableism and disableism works. So the first theorization from the 70s, when they started to say disability is a question of social oppression, start to be more complex when we think how ableism, that means the system that differentiates between able and disabled and evaluate everything that is related to disability. It also has disableism, that which will mean the specific discrimination against disability. And to understand that is really useful to think about an analogy with gender, where ableism will be sexism or patriarchy or sex-gender systems, so the general systems that divide population between female and male and reward everything related with male and do the opposite with female or femininity. And disableism will be the specific discrimination. when we think about discrimination, it's not only a matter of material exclusion or lack of accessibility, but a symbolic way to devaluate everything related with disability or dehumanize that. In that sense, it's important to think that sometimes some ways of highlight disability as a heroic thing, like they are superheroes or they are superhuman, is a way of dehumanize them as well. Because what we are projecting is that there are only two possibilities. None of them are human. So there are even infrahuman, not human at all, or they are superhuman. And I would like to share only 2 minutes of this wonderful talk from the activist Stella Young. You can see all the talk online, so I strongly recommend that. But let me share how she started, because I think quite
I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. You know, I went to school, I hung out with my friends, I fought with my younger sisters. It was all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah. And they were right, you know, I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right, you know, I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later, I was on my second teaching round in a Melbourne high school, and I was about 20 minutes into a Year 11 legal studies class when this boy put up his hand and said, "Hey miss, when are you going to start doing your speech?" And I said, "What speech?" You know, I'd been talking to them about defamation law for a good 20 minutes. And he said, you know, like your motivational speaking. You know, when people in wheelchairs come to school, they usually say, like, inspirational stuff. Yeah. It's usually in the big hall. And that's when it dawned on me. This kid had only ever experienced disabled people as objects of inspiration. We are not, you know, to this kid, and it's not his fault. I mean, that's true for many of us. You know, for lots of us, disabled people are not our teachers or our doctors or our manicurists. We're not real people. We are there to inspire.
So you are seeing the presentation again, right? Yeah, we are in the PowerPoint again, right? Yeah. I think, yeah, Stella Young points out in a really precise way what is this idea of the inspirational form and how the ableist gaze construct and project disability. So finally, I would like to share with you how in Spain disability is seen. And from the activist point of view, in the first 1 century, they started to talk or to define a diversity model. So the independent living movement in Spain, they are inspired by the social model of disability and by the international independent living movement, but also they adequate and theorize their own model that is called and is published as the diversity model. So, for example, they do this allusion to the independent living movement, and you can see below, nada sobre nosotros sin nosotros, so nothing about us without us, as the independent living movement say. But at the same time, they prefer to use functional diversity instead of disability, because they want to point out that they work in a different mode, they do things differently, but it doesn't mean that is worse or is less able. So for example, the activist on the left, he says, I don't suffer from disability, I suffer from discrimination. So they can communicate through sign language or braille, or they can move through a wheelchair, and the problem is the discrimination, not the difference. And this is important to understand how crip claims arrive or start in Spain. So let's think, what is crip in Spain? During my PhD research that started in 2013 and finished in 2017, this was my framework, my theoretical and activist framework, and was in the intersection between gender and disability, and also the queer and crip theory. So my theoretical framework was the feminist disability studies, the queer crip approaches, and my PhD thesis is called, in English would be, Impertinent Bodies, a queer crip approach to the possibilities of subversion from functional diversity. And functional diversity, as I have explained before, is how disabled people call themselves in the independent living, Spanish independent living activism. So this, let me explain before how I conducted the research. It was an ethnographic research based on participant observation, thanks to my collaboration with the WIFAC project, and I also did qualitative interviews with activists, and I was following the social media and the mainstream media to check and update what was the conversation about sexuality, gender, and disability. So let's stop for a moment and think about what crip theory is, because to think about what crip is in Spain, first of all, we should understand how some overall American authors have theorized crip, and you can see some of the main references here from McRuer and Kaffer. It came from queer theory, and as we know, queer theory gender theory starts to deconstruct gender. So it says, okay, so sex difference between male and female, it doesn't imply a cultural discrimination, but also with queer theory, we start to deconstruct sex as well, and we start to rethink how gender and sex are construct each other, because we cannot understand the sex difference without understanding that there is a gender dichotomy. In the same sense, now in critical disability studies, we are trying to point out that impairment, the idea of the impaired body or mind, it doesn't exist outside of the idea of disability, because the social oppression, the disability as a social barrier, pre-exists to the idea of the impairment. So crip theory tried to deconstruct these dichotomies between able and disabled, healthy and ill, that the social model in its try to fight against the barriers, at the same time it was constructing this dichotomy. And crip theory, which is really related to activism, also use provocation, parody, and transgression as a way of reappropriation of a stigma or insult. And it promotes the idea of disability as a difference, disability as a political identity, and disability that can be a question of pride or a pride. So in the Spanish context, of course, we have the coexistence of different models and comprehensions of disability. So there is still an hegemony, I think, of the medical model who conceptualize disability as an impairment, but also we have a quite a strong social model regarding our legislation. Spain, as well as the United States and the majority of countries, has signed the Convention of Disabled People's Rights, which incorporated disability the social model as the official model. So it says disability is not a question of a deficit, an individual deficit. It's the intersection between disabling barriers and body differences. And as I explained, we have this minority but strong activist model that is called diversity model. And then, like 10 years ago, sexuality started to play an important role in relation to disability claims. And there is two things quite important, that is the political aspect and the identity aspect, because sexuality becomes a huge topic in relation to disability, because it starts to show that disabled people are sexual beings, but also politicized. It's a politicized identity, because sexuality is not just a question of right, it's a question of enunciation. These are some of the images of process and projects and people and events and parties and artists images related to the project Yes We Fuck. So I started the project with some activist colleagues and friends, and in relation to the project Yes We Fuck, it was quite a long project because we didn't have any funding at the beginning, so we stayed like 2.5 years filming the documentary, and during this time a lot of things happened at the same time. So it promoted an alliance between the queer activists that was already quite strong in Spain and the crip activists that was not strong at all. There was this functional diversity activism that became crip or tullido in Spanish, thanks to the connection with the activist movement. And my PhD thesis was based on analyzing this alliance and this potentiality of coming together from the dissidents. We are going to show, to see just the trailer of Yes We Fuck, but I strongly recommend as well to see it, all the documentary that is available online with English subtitles. It has some explicit images regarding sexuality and disability.
Sorry, Andrea, we're not seeing the video.
Okay, let me check. Why? You are seeing still the presentation? Okay, I don't know why. Are you seeing the video now? No?
No, only your pictures.
Okay, I don't know why, because before I did the same, but then I'm going to share just there. And just to check, it's like 15 minutes more, 20 minutes more is okay, Rosella? How are we with the time?
We're like until 11:30, but we can have some few minutes. Yeah, now we can see it. We can see it now.
Bueno, para mí el sexo es una de las bases más importantes o uno de los cimientos de la persona humana, ¿no? De cualquier persona. Es una fuente de gozo, de interacción con los demás, de crecimiento personal. Para mí es todo eso y nada más y nada menos, ¿no? que eso.
El sexo es un asunto serio. El sexo es reír, flotar, disolverse.
El sexo es algo natural, algo que nos forma, que nos conforma y abarca, bueno, todos los aspectos de nuestra vida. El sexo en general, somos criaturas sexuadas.
En mi primera vez, así que te pido que tengas cuidado.
Tranquilo, que tendré cuidado contigo. Como sé que es tu primera vez en el BDSM, ¿no? Es la primera vez. Pues para mí también es la primera vez con una persona con diversidad funcional. Que yo también estoy nerviosa, ¿eh?
la sociedad puede ver con normalidad que otro de nuestros hijos pueda formar una pareja, aunque no esté preparado porque nadie le exige ninguna cartilla, ni ningún aprobado, ni ningún test para ver si puede irse con una persona a vivir, y las personas con discapacidad siempre las tenemos en tela de juicio. Cualquier acto que hacen, cualquier razón o cualquier cosa que no hagan como a nosotros nos parece, pues siempre les achacamos a que es una persona con discapacidad.
¿Qué es ahora? ¿Empezamos?
Venga.
Dale.
Empecemos.
And let's go back to the presentation. Okay, then yeah, I strongly recommend you to watch the documentary. It's available online with English subtitle, and it tells the 6 stories. Wait. Sorry, I had a problem with the connection. Then what does crip mean in Spain? I just would point out three ideas or 3 important contributions. So first of all, sexuality was a main concern for this alliance between crip and queer. And these are some images from the Yes We Fuck documentary. And I think one of the most important things is that when we talk about sexuality and disability, we were not talking only about the right of having a sexuality or exploring sexuality or being a desiring subject, but also of being desirables. And I think this is one of the main contributions of this radical alliance, to see disability as a value, as something that can add value to sexuality, can enrich our sexuality, can diversify it, can challenge some normative approach to sexual relationships, affective relationships, or even sex games or sex interaction. And this is one of the stories of Yes We Fuck, but it was one of the main value of this alliance. The importance of sexuality as a political fact that challenge so many ideas, ableist ideas of what sexuality, what disability means. Secondly, one important thing about a crip approach is to talk about impairment, because sometimes from a more social model of disability, we only focus on disabling barriers, and we think about disability and the oppression against disabled bodies, but then we forget, or we don't dare to talk about the difference, the embodied difference. And one of the most interesting contribution of this activism is to reflect and to show and to play with the impairment. So, for example, in the field of integrated art or sport, you can think disability as something that you should overcome or hide or forget, or you can play with that and put in the center of the stage. And these artists are doing here. So, for example, Tommy Ojeda is imitating Marilyn Monroe, and when the skirt of Marilyn goes up, she shows her prosthesis. And third, how this coming out of the closet regarding impairment, prosthesis, orthesis, and body difference in a broad way goes towards a crip pride. And the use that we talked before of humor, transgression, parodies. So, for example, it was a campaign where they were hacking the front cover of some famous magazine as Time or Playboy, and they are playing with the idea of crip power, the new revolution, or crip is sexy, crip is trendy, crip yourself. Or on the right, my friend Elena Prose is hacking. It could be cripple parking. saying I piece in your concept, and it's her urine back. So after doing this research and my postdoc related to that, I started to reflect if this alliance is so great and we can challenge so many things together regarding gender normativity and able normativity, why is this so small? I mean, why this alliance between crip and queer and feminism in a broad sense, it doesn't expand broader. So in my current book, I'm writing right now a book, and I'm really excited to share with you the trailer of the book, because it's not finished yet, but it will be published next year, 2023. Then I start now to reflect about how ableism and sexism intersect and how it's reflected in the traditional and historical fights of the feminist movement and the anti-ableist movement. And as we know, intersectionality is a necessary approach to this conversation and all of conversation currently, actually, because as other lords say, there is no such thing as single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. So just 3 ideas that I'm working on the book. The book is the book in progress. It's called El Cuerpo Deseado, Estudios Feministas de la Discapacidad. It's in Spanish, but the translation would be The Desired Body, Feminist Disability Studies. And I'm working around 5 issues that I condensated, I put together in this presentation in 3 discussions. So first of all, maybe one of the most obvious conflict or tension between disability and feminism is related to care, because as we have seen, independent living movement has theorized care as a question that can be related to social oppression, because usually disabled people are just seen as a burden for women, for families, and they want to break out that and say, we want to decide about our lives. Nothing about us without us. We don't want to be taken, we don't want to be cared by our familiars or these traditional nursing homes. We want to have personal assistance to live our life in an independent way. But then sometimes it seems that there is not a feminist approach to these claims. And on the other side, on the other hand, feminist theorization about care is more related to the position of the caregiver, that is usually the majority of time a woman. So this image on the right show how usually or more traditionally feminism theorizes care as a woman that has this burden. In that sense, is crossed by social class and migration and racialization, of course, because not all the women care or do care work in the same sense are the women in the less valued position that do it in a more precarious or informal way. But anyway, are mainly women. But it's paradoxically that sometimes it seems that there is a conflict between people that provide the care and people that receive the care. It's paradoxic, I mean, because the majority of people that receive the care are actually women, because women, we arrive to older age, we live more years, and we arrive with worse health conditions. So how can it be possible that when we think about the position of women related to care, we only think as potential caregivers and not as potential people who receive care? And another conflict that is related to some rights. So, for example, abortion or the right to end a pregnancy, or the right to decide when your life should finish. I mean, euthanasia, that was recently regulated in Spain. But as the independent living activism has pointed out, there are some tricky arguments when we defend these rights to decide about our bodies in relation to abortion or in relation to euthanasia, because sometimes we don't defend that as an individual choice, but as a question of common sense, that sometimes some lives are not worth living, sometimes are necessary and essentially a tragedy, are lives that shouldn't be born or shouldn't be lived. So, for example, this film, Me Before You, was strongly criticized because it gives the message that if you are disabled, you are better off dead. So it started the campaign Me Before Euthanasia, for example. And maybe we can go in deep in the discussion about these topics, because now I'm opening 3 really huge field of discussions. So let's go in deep in the one that you find more interesting after. So the second point that I think are a challenge for this alliance, for this intersectional alliance between feminism and anti-ableism, is about gender roles and gender oppression, because usually feminism has theorized femininity as a oppressive identity, because women are forced to comply with some roles. For example, to be desired by the male gaze, to be objectified as sexual objects, or to be forced to be caregivers or mothers. However, in relation to disability, it's totally different. Disabled women are not seen as these sexual objects or these ideal mothers. On the contrary, a lot of times they are not allowed to express their sexuality or to think about their motherhood. Here there are some pictures of the model Madeleine Stewart. Is an Australian model. She's the one, the first one that has done like mainstream campaigns, even if she's a woman with Down syndrome. And I think it's quite interesting to reflect about her and other disabled women in privileged positions. There are not so many actually, because she performs some normative gender roles in relation to femininity. Of course, we can see her images and how her body has changed to accomplish the gender ideal. But at the same time, she is challenging some stereotypes about disability, and you cannot be desired, or you cannot have a partner. She has it, and she shows in her social media, or she even did this photo show dressed as in the white dress that has an important symbolic meaning in relation to femininity. But also when we think about what is to be a man or what masculinity means, is really a challenge when we cross the variable disability. So, for example, I was thinking about the Me Too movement and how this movement has pointed out that men in position of power sometimes, so many times, use their power position to exercise sexual violence and harassment towards women. And we usually the idea is this cis hetero white man in a position of privilege. But Stephen Hawking was this man, so he was in this position. And if we don't cross this by disability, we cannot understand his situation. His daughter and his son, and also his nurses, affirm that his ex-wife humiliated him, punished him, and even abused him in a physical way. He went to hospital several times. He never confessed that, neither his wife, so we cannot be sure what happened there. But anyway, it challenged our idea of heterosexual relationships and powerful men, because in that case, it seems that the vulnerable body was the disabled one that went to the hospital with some marks and heridas and yeah. evidences of physical abuse. I don't mean that then disability challenge absolutely gender dichotomies and then disabled men are so vulnerable as women. I'm not saying that. I say that it challenges and moves our board, our perceptions, because now we have 2 accusations of rape against the French Minister of Disability, and he is himself a man with disabilities, with a disability, and he affirms, he says that he couldn't rape the women because he couldn't physically abuse a woman. So he's using his physical difference to deal with the accusations. So we can see how this, when we think about violence, also is challenged by disability because it changes the way that we usually think about vulnerability, and victimization. And finally, just to open conversation, not to end it, sexual assistance is my last topic. Sexual assistance mean really different things in different contexts. Maybe your first images about that is the film The Sessions with Helen Hunt, which is based on a true story. But what we see in that movie is not specifically sexual assistance by sexual surrogate, that is a sexual therapy promoted by Sociology and is for everyone, not just for disabled people, but there is a common misunderstanding that thinks this is something specifically for disabled. Anyway, sexual assistance can mean a therapeutical approach to disabled sexuality, but also some kind of prostitution or special sex work. In that sense, the quote that Rosella highlighted at the beginning is from a chapter where I compared 2 Spanish documentaries that show different ideas of what sexual assistance can mean. One of them that you can see on the top of the slide is called I Want Sex Too, and it promotes a more therapeutical approach to sexuality as a way to connect disabled body with joy and energy and affection. But I think the idea that we tried to point it out in Yes We Fuck was a little different, because the sexual assistance in that documentary is more related to the right to decide about your own body, self-exploration or exploration with your partner. It's not defined yet what sexual assistance means, but I think it brings and refreshes some traditional feminist discussions regarding the right to the own body, sexuality, or sex work, or even consent. And these are the things that I'm interested in move and challenge in my book. So I will finish here with this open discussion. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm happy to discuss with you now or later through my, here there is my contact details. Twitter, Facebook, and also my email if someone has something that don't want to share right now, can contact me later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing ideas. I actually would like to especially thank you because it was not at all easy to just pick up one specific part of your work, which is, which spans between different topics around disability and gender studies in general. And actually also it covers a number of very controversial issues that are absolutely at the very beginning. So we're just starting to have a debate, a public debate about this, and also, well, having also wider research about these issues in a number of disciplines. So I wanted really to thank you also because you accepted to the challenge to cover some of this of the most controversial aspects of your work. And as far as I saw, in the chat, there's already a lot of especially students that have been engaging in even their own conversation about this. Yeah, I guess that it sparked also pretty much interest for yeah, a number of undergraduate students. So we are going to have kind of 30 minutes of conversation. So I guess that we can just try to share some of the most, you know, of the hardest topic, of the hardest ideas coming from this. So let me, yeah, there's a lot of comments already.
Yeah, I'm seeing the chat now and I'm overwhelmed, like.
Yeah, very well. I'm trying to a little bit select some of those that can be similar to others, so we can also hear from faculty, from any other participants. So many questions were revolving around what causes this separation. Well, this is, I guess that this kind of interest is also worth to explore. So why do disabled people need it? I mean, why did they need to create their own group? This was actually something that maybe you already touched upon when it came to explain how different social movements, also the feminist ones, let's say, how they started. So where does it come from, this need to differentiate themselves, even in a social way, and to create their own group, as if there's some sort of, you know, niche to be protected? I guess that this is not to be taken for granted. Many students were, yeah, wondering about this. Where does it come from, such a necessity? And yeah, why in this case, and I think that intersectionality comes exactly here, why does disability seem to conclude one's identity, to be, you know, one's own specific feature, you know? So when somebody looks at you, the first thing that, even according to disability rights movement, should examine and take into consideration is your own disability. What would you say about this?
So many things. So regarding the first part of the question, that was where it came from or come from. I think the majority of political groups or political claims came from political oppression. So in that sense, I think is something that can be seen as an analogy with the feminist movement, like why women at the beginning, only women went together to fight for their rights. Maybe because they didn't have their rights. So I think, yeah, it's quite tricky to understand what starts before. And there is a current discussion, really interesting, about that, this identity politics or politics of identity, because when we claim an identity, on one hand, we claim for some rights, but at the same time, we close and essentialize this identity, and it has some dangers. It's a dangerous position also for doing alliances or for understanding how our fights should be joined and shared fights. So I think it's not really different from other identities as women or racial identities. So on one hand, you go together to politicize your claims and to ask for your rights. But at the same time that you do that, you reinforce the idea that you are essentially different and you are a separated group from society. And this is really tricky. For example, this is that I was trying to explain regarding care. When we started to think care from essential positions, like, no, I'm essentially a disabled person that needs to be to have personal assistance, and this is my only concern, and I want to be the most independent as possible. Or I'm a woman that is providing care for disabled people, so this is my only concern. We started to fraction our identities in really small groups, because then we can think that is not the same, of course, white women that black women that provide care, because there are different conditions and intellectual or physical disabled, and we started to do small groups. And then sometimes we lose the focus that the problem is care is organized in an unequal way because of the patriarchal and ableist way of seeing care as something that is not value, something that is not, it doesn't need or doesn't value enough to have social recognition, economic recognition. So sometimes it seems that the social organization of care is a question of a small group. So should we invest more money in care for old people that live? No, it's an essential and vertebral problem of our society. So if we start to be together, we can articulate new ways of organizing care and pointing out that all of us are interdependent and vulnerable, and we need care, and we provide care in different ways, and we are the majority. We are not a small group.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I think that especially in your in this comment is very visible. Yeah, I guess your sociological route. So where do we, what should we look for care? Actually, in a structural way. So not to whom care is directed to, but actually what care is. How is that structured itself? And I wanted to ask you, and actually just to pose you another question that I saw in the chat. So how do you think beliefs and attitudes of society toward differently abled individuals affect those individuals' psychological development, their sexual development and self-identity?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not a super expert about how they subjectize these social images. But actually, in my last chapter in the book, I started to reflect about that. That is a new topic for me, so this is just like fresh news. But yeah, I started to think specifically about that. Like, okay, I have analyzed already the ableist framework, the ableist discourses, but how that is embodied by disabled people. And for example, I analyzed that in people that were recently injured. So my last ethnographic fieldwork was in relation to rehabilitation unit. So I was doing participant observation and interviews with people that had an accident and were the first month or the first year of their lives as disabled people that were using wheelchair and were trying to figure out and understand how their bodies work now in relation. The majority of them were people with spinal cord injury, so it was in relation to the lack of mobility or different sensibility. And I don't have a definite answer, but of course, one thing that I'm quite sure is that you cannot understand impairment and disability as something different, because they are understanding how their impaired bodies work. So, for example, I cannot move my legs, or now I don't have sensibility from my chest down. This is a more physical thing, but it's strongly related with the social conception that we have about the lack of mobility or different sensibility. So you cannot differentiate both things, because you have the ableist framework absolutely embodied, seeing that your new way of moving or sense is worse, is not valued, is a tragedy. So you have all the time the society reflecting you that now your body is tragic, your way of moving is tragic, is a tragedy. So how you embody that, how you feel that, is strongly connected about how society explains you that you are now, because we can think about other strongly and radical body changes, as for example, with a baby become a child, but this is socially rewarded all the time and applauded and seen as something wonderful. So the child is super happy of the body change. but when it's a disability, it's not at all like that. And maybe this is quite a controversial topic, just to open all the boxes now. But how can we think about that is when we reflect about people that call themselves transabled. Maybe you are not familiarized with that, but there are people that feel that they are disabled people, even if their bodies work in a normative way. So they don't have any diagnosis, they don't have any physical or functional differences. They just feel that their body should be disabled. So for example, they have the need or the desire to amputate a leg or to acquire a spinal cord injury. And it usually blows everyone's minds, because the idea to choose disability is something unthinkable. The ableist system is so strong that to think about disabled body, that something is not a tragedy, but even a choice, is absolutely radical. I'm not saying that I'm defending any surgery regarding disabling a body, but I think it's quite interesting to reveal how ableist is our conception.
Oh, thank you so much. This is really this last thing will it's definitely worthy an entire further seminar. This is really interesting, and actually, yeah, I would like just to touch something, really a hot topic, and I would like to just tackle it with the help of some students that typed this in the chat. She said, this student said, I have also noticed that people treat disabled people as if they have no longing feelings for a sexual relationship. People neglect their needs and only tend to their basic necessities, such as bathing, eating, etc. I feel like the topic is taboo for a lot of people, and they are not ready to have that conversation yet. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, here, for instance, the students calls sexuality, I mean, what she is referring to is sexuality, because you have been talking about this. So how would you conceptualize, according to disability studies, to your research, sexuality? Is this a need that should be fulfilled? Is this a desire? And I'm gonna go further on this. Why is sexuality, if we take sexuality as a relationship, if we take sexuality as our capacity to be relating to each other, effectively in contact with each other, why is this a right that should be fulfilled through the use of another body? I'm touching here a little bit also on sex work, but just very superficially. I'm not going to go into that because it's another topic. But I mean, there is even some feminist standpoints that argue that, you know, we cannot talk in terms of sex work because that is neither sex nor work that you are selling. You are selling, there are some scholars and activists that say this, you are selling an abuse. Yeah. And it's still an abuse, even if you are doing that, if you are selling that to a person with a disability. So with a person that is potentially physically not able to fulfill this need or desire without anyone else. Yeah. So what's your basic, I know that this is not only controversial, it's very general question and would require more time. What is your take on this? So first of all, is sexuality a relationship? And why do all of us, and in this case, people with disability, should reclaim, you know, a relationship? How is that possible? Yeah.
Well, this is also a hot topic and another PhD thesis maybe. So I'm not totally sure what sexuality is, because what I'm interested in is how sexuality is taken for political purpose. So when, for example, there is a chapter, the chapter about sexuality in my book, where I analyze how sexuality is conceptualized as a right, as a need, as a desire, and as a human need. So things that you were saying. And what I'm interested about is when you choose these different frameworks, it's because you want to fight for different things. So if you say it's a human need, it implies something. If it's a right, you are asking for other things, and how it moves and which collectives, which political groups use different frameworks is that more interests me. So not to promote a closed definition or a normative definition, but to understand how is a political game, the definition of sexuality in the same, and it's really related to sexual assistance, of course. So for example, if you want a more therapeutical approach, you are going to use the frame that is a human need, is something that you need. You need it in the same way that you need to go to the bathroom and you need to eat. But then it reminds a more medical model of disability, where you should provide services because these bodies are impaired. So the more activist approach to sexual assistance use the framework of right, then it's more a social model of sexuality, of disability, because it's the idea that, okay, no, we don't need a therapeutical expert therapy, we need rights. We need to access in the same right as everyone else. So we have right to sexuality as everyone else has. So it's a matter of political public policies towards equality. But in that sense, we have the same problem that we have with social model in general, that these approaches usually are a little bit afraid of difference or impairment. So what will be a crip sexual approach or a diversity model approach to sexuality? And I think the most interesting proposals came from these new languages toward about sexuality and how sexuality and disability can challenge. So for me, one of the most fascinating things is when we think, for example, about heterosexuality. What does it mean when the male and female bodies cannot accomplish the normative roles of who is active and who is passive, who penetrates and who is being penetrated, who is strong and who is weak? So it's not only, for me, the interesting thing about bringing disability in the feminist conversation is not what can we do for them, is how it challenges our ideas of what male and women and female mean, or sexuality mean, or sexual relation mean. Because, for example, when they claim for sexual assistance to help a disabled couple, so both of them are physically impaired and they need a third person to help with some postures, or even to come close because they cannot approach each other's bodies. What does it mean? Then the sexual assistant is not implied in the erotic relationship. It's not her or his body who is eroticized, but is present in a sexual and intimate relationship. So it challenges our conversation about sex work, if it's abuse, not abuse, it's always slavery, it's not, because it's a different thing. It's a different situation.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is very insightful what you said. So you are interested to disability, not actually to figure out what to do with people with disability, but how actually disability itself as a specific embodied model of existence does affect the other part of reality, let's say, that is the so-called people without disabilities. So this is really, really interesting for me. And I'm still scrolling down on the many questions that my students and other have been leaving here. We will actually try to save them. So if I'm just missing some of them, I will also email you all of their thoughts and comments, and I really would like to thank them. And so just I wanted to also ask from any thoughts about faculty, other scholars that I know that are here, and I'm very grateful to them. And just before, since we have we have definitely even 10 minutes, full 10 minutes. So I was thinking, Lisa, thank you very much. She's thanking you, Lisa Osbeck, the head of our psychology program. And I was thinking about this, Andrea. So I was fascinated about how you were describing in your recent chapter the difference between, let's say, the activist, what you call the crip queer model of one documentary versus the medical rehabilitation documentary. And you were, among differences that you discussed, is exactly this. So if the crip queer is more politicized, it's also true that it's a little bit less embodied. So I would like you to a little bit explain what you mean, because I know how much the embodiment is important for you, just to let's say re-embody the disability studies as well. So just if you can say a few words, and then I also saw another question from some of other colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I will try to be brief, because for me this chapter is really the transition point from my PhD to my current book. And I have seen that there is a question also about what inspired you to write this book. And one of the things was like, okay, I was involved in this with fact, I did this research and was like, okay, that is great. Why is not everyone like politicizing their condition? And then we did Yes We Fact, and it was really successful. It won so many prizes. But I felt, and I could observe in my ethnographic fieldwork, that there were not so many disabled people involved in the process. There was a minority really politicized that really loved the project and changed their lives, absolutely. But it was not a majority. There were so many people with disability that didn't feel reflect in the documentary, or felt the documentary as something maybe too radical or too far away from their reality. And then the public TV did the second documentary, that is I Want Sex Too, that I found super ableist, like is this medical approach of the tragedy or the pity approach, and the music and the images and the characters. But it was super successful. And it was like, what is happening here? How is possible in the same context? We do Yes We Fact, and after they do, like 2 years after, this I Want Sex Too, that is like going back 30 years ago, and it's equally successful and even more inside disabled community. So I started to reflect how this triumphalist idea of Yes We Fact, we are desiring undesirable, maybe is tricky in some sense. And this is the conclusion of the chapter, that also the queer crip character that is promoted by Yes We Fact is in a sense disembodied, because it doesn't listen to vulnerability. It doesn't listen to some of the problems that are associated to disability, and some of the embodied problems, that the pain or the suffering or the mental health issues or the anxiety or the fear or the emotions, or all these negative emotions that are more related to the tragedy, and then sometimes are silenced by the most critical activist approaches. And maybe I Want Sex Too was successful, because even in this ableist way, it took into account the suffering that a lot of people are experiencing in relation to sexuality. So it's this like transitional point to the book where I try to make a broader message and to connect with feminist and disability experience in a broader way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. And I'm actually bringing you a couple of other comments. So the first one is, the medical model seems to set limits to what is defined as caregiving, taking, and sharing. And yeah, so this colleague was just highlighting this aspect that you were talking about. And yeah, she needed to go. But then I wanted especially to focus on this one from Betsy Dance from our university. Very glad that they're here. So Betsy says, disability scholars can be both interested in the theorization of disability for what it can show us about non-disability, and in an effort to improve the living conditions of disabled folks. No need to follow a binary. So what do you think about this?
I totally agree. And yeah, maybe my English is not so good, so maybe sometimes I don't precise things in the correct way, but I totally agree with the comment. And I think one of the things, for example, that I started the book with in the introduction is pointing out that when we talk or we approach critical disability studies, we should talk or reflect about disability and ability also, because there are the two sides of the same coin. So I think when we talk about gender studies, we shouldn't think about women's experiences. We should think about gender as a system, power system. And when we think about disability, we should think about how it constructs ability and disability. So for me, yeah, critical disability studies should approach both the ableist and disabled system and also the concrete experiences of people with disabilities.
Really, really, thank you so much, Andrea. I just wanted to conclude with saying something, if there's nobody that wants to share anything else. But yeah, I know that the discussion should have taken full 2 hours, but we don't have, yeah, unfortunately enough time. But this is a very good introduction to the topic. So I thought, yeah, that could be really already very good to start from this point. So I really wanted to highlight what you said before, when you said, yeah, we talk in terms of the people with disabilities needs when it comes also, among other things, when it comes to sexuality. But this is saying something also to people without, let's say, body matter disabilities, because of course we didn't cover all the aspects related to intellectual disabilities. That is another specific field in this discipline and in your research. So I was thinking, is the point the subjectivity, who can be actually seen as a subject in the sexuality realms, for instance? And when we talk in terms of sex tools and all the philosophy, I mean, even Preciado, how Preciado theorizes what dildo is. Dildo is a subject, is a prosthetic subject by itself. So it's even more than an object, a tool. So what you made me think about what you said about when, let's say, heterosexual, but even non-heterosexual people, I mean, in general, people without diagnosed disabilities, when they actually try to use, I would keep this term, to use other people in their previously in their standard relationship. Is that a way to fulfill a need? And this comes back again into what is sexuality. So are also people without disabilities actually asking and learning technologically, I would say, to use objects, people as new subjects. So I know that it is a little bit a mess, but you made me think about this. Yeah, definitely how disability is a further layer that totally reconfigures the embodied aspect of relationship and the embodied aspects, yeah, of affectivity. So I really wanted to thank you, Andrea, for this. I don't know if you want to just share a final word. We are a little bit running out of time.
I just want to thank you for the invitation and all the university and department for having me here. And I'm really excited about so many comments. I'm just a little bit sad that I cannot answer all of them, but I'm really happy because usually in Zoom or online it's more difficult to engage with people, but I'm super happy that people were really, I'm just reading it really fast, all the comments, and we can be in touch through my social media or
yeah, exactly. I would like also to actually say I'm sorry to all those people that were trying to join, but I don't know what happened, because actually we had a number of, well, more than 90 people registered, so something must have been going on that was preventing a number of people to join on Zoom. I tried to a little bit also add the live stream on Facebook, but just to let you know that I'm sorry if many of you were trying to stay to join since the beginning. By the way, we are recording the event, so it will be available for all of you after today's meeting, and yeah, you're gonna have the possibility to see it since the beginning. So I'd like to thank you once again, Andrea, for sharing your research with us. I would like to thank once again all students that were here, all people joining from Europe, from the US, and wherever. And it was really a pleasure. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you.
And
thank you so
enjoy
much.
the rest of your day.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day. For me, it's already evening, but you still
yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you so much. Take care.